Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and have the privilege today to sit down with Tim Starks. Tim is a senior reporter at Cyberscoop, has had multiple cyber reporting jobs. Most recently, prior to Cyberscoop, was at Washington Post 202, which was one of my favorite daily reads. Prior to that was at Politico, was also at Cyberscoop in a previous life, and like many top reporters in D.C., cut his teeth at Congressional Quarterly. Tim's been covering the cyber beat since 2003, so that puts him at over 20 years. Just when we started calling it cyber, it was known as InfoSec, Information Assurance, and pretty much everything else prior to that. Truly one of the best in the business, and comes from Indiana, so basketball is near and dear to him. And Tim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here. I was just on the phone with somebody for a story yesterday, and I had not talked to them since 2004.
Wow.
And then because I was about to talk to you, I was like, wait, I've been talking to Frank since the early 2000s.
Been a while. It's been a while.
Like, we were talking about Homeland Security before you and I were talking about cybersecurity so explicitly, but yeah.
True that, and we did not talk about basketball,
We did.
So tell me about basketball before we kick this off.
You know, my growing up, I grew up in Indiana playing basketball. I rebelled against it because I was rebelling against anything that everybody else liked, because I was that kind of teenager. But I've come to really like basketball, and I happened to be fortunate enough to attend the University of Southern Indiana during the tenure of current Auburn coach Bruce Pearl,
BP,
and he won a Division II championship for us.
Well, I'll be.
It was a big deal. You would not believe how crazy the campus of USI went about that. We even, just to give you a sense of how important it was, they started a line of colas that were commemorating various people who were involved in the championship. I think Bruce had one, but certainly our college president had one. So, and he was also the guy who led our weight training class one of the years I was there. So, you know, when you're a small, I don't know if it's like this at the big schools, but at the small schools, if you're the university basketball coach, you might also have to teach some classes. So it was great to see that name and remember that Bruce was a big part of my youth.
Well, awesome. There's only one Bruce Pearl, and may we win the national championship this year. We got a pretty good recruiting class.
I'm rooting for you.
Thanks, Tim. So let's start with you've been doing a lot of reporting of late, as always, and one of the stories that you seem to come back to is around spyware, which I think is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, both from a national security perspective, also obviously from a privacy perspective. Why don't we start there, and if you can maybe paint a picture to give the landscape, what we're dealing with, why it matters, and the like.
Yeah, this was when I was coming back to Cyberscoop as a full-time reporter, because first time I was there, I was part editor, part reporter. This time I came back as full reporter, and they asked me, what would you like to be covering? And they had their own ideas about the gaps in coverage, but the first words out of my mouth were spyware. And the word doesn't have a strong definition in our field. Sometimes you'll see threat researchers say, oh, we're reporting on this spyware, but the kind of thing I'm talking about is the commercial mercenary kind of spyware. I'm thinking of the NSO group or the group that produces the Predator spyware. There's some other groups as well. These are the groups that have just some of the most sophisticated kind of attack capabilities of anything in cyber. It's way up there. I mean, the only thing that might compare is the sort of state level, really elite countries that are really good at this kind of thing. So you're talking Russia, you're talking China, you're talking us. The only people who have those kind of capabilities are that, and then the next level down, just below that, is the spyware level. So there's the sophistication of it that's interesting. I think the thing that also
zero days we're talking
0 days, and yeah, I was going to get into that in a second. The other thing that's really compelling to me about it is that it's one where you can really directly show how much this is mattering to people's lives. You can do that sometimes with cyber, but sometimes it's a big number. It's $1 trillion worth of intellectual property transferred. How much does that relate to the average person? This stuff goes right at harms that you can show. You can say that this repressive government spied on this particular person and then put them in jail, or something worse. So there's that level of it. But to go back to the technical side of things, the number 0 is often associated with these guys because they're using the 0-day attacks, and that's I'm assuming your audience knows what a 0-day attack is, but I'm going to explain it anyway.
Sure, please.
Is an attack that has not yet been publicly identified or called out. They're things that they've discovered, they found or bought, vulnerabilities that just have not been exploited at a level that anybody has seen yet. And then they're also the other 0 that they're associated with is 0 clicks, where most of the time, as you know, if you get hacked, you have to have done something. You had to have clicked on a thing, click on a URL, and go, "Oops, I got social engineered. So they found me, and now I'm downloading something and I didn't mean to." This stuff just goes on your phone. It's just there.
Which is disconcerting, and it's been utilized and used against dissidents and others. And an executive order was promulgated last year on the issue, and I know there have been sanctions levied against individuals and companies. So this is becoming a bigger issue. You wrote a really interesting piece around Poland.
Yeah.
And some of the steps they are taking to address this.
Yeah, I'm happy to get back to what the U.S. has been doing, because I think...
Yeah, we will.
If you're good, if you're looking at who's doing the most on this, I think you probably can still say, at least policy-wise, it's the United States. If you're looking at the reckoning internally, if you're looking at okay, what have we done? What should we not be doing? Poland is the sort of unexpected place.
And why? Why is that? Just out of curiosity.
Because if you look at the reckoning that's happened in Europe, there have been a number of countries in Europe that have been accused credibly of using this spyware. Poland was one of them.
Okay.
Some of them cooperated with the so-called Pegasus Committee, that was the European Parliament Committee that was really trying to find out what happened and do something about it. Poland was not one of the countries that cooperated. They were one of the countries that gave a stiff arm to the people who were investigating this and said, "We're fine. Don't worry about us." And something remarkable has happened there, because there's been a change in the leadership. And the people who have come in were people who had reputations before they came in of leading the country that were very focused on civil liberties and human rights. And if you want to be slightly cynical about it, and I'm not saying you should, if you want to question the motives, as the outgoing party did and has and is continuing to do, you can say, well, they say they were spied on by the previous administration, so of course they have every reason to get revenge. Certainly they have a motivation from the standpoint of they can say, look, it happened to us. And courts have evaluated it and said that's the case. And now increasingly, with this investigation that really just started a few months ago, there have been a lot of big revelations about what Poland was doing that we didn't know before.
Interesting. And do you think it has momentum with some of the... Because, I mean, you also look at examples like Estonia, who become cyber powers, in part because they are the antithesis of everything Soviet, as anti-communist and as transparent as one can be. Do you see it having momentum among other European nations? Anything the U.S. can glean?
Yeah, perchance. I mean, you might have seen this because you follow the UN Group of Governmental Experts stuff. Russia was just bad-mouthing the U.S. in a document that came out just a couple days ago, I think, saying that we have been using it too much. I think the U.S. has more dabbled with it than that they've used it on the scale that we're talking about with something like Poland. They've explored it. They have used some elements of it. But so if the U.S. wants to go back and look at what they've been doing, yes, I think they could follow what Poland's doing. But I think what's hard about what Poland's doing is this is the confluence of circumstances that led them to be willing to do this. And the most comparable previous example was Mexico, and they had an opportunity to explore this further, and they really didn't. So there's the people who are the activists and the people who are the researchers on this who say, yeah, actually this could be a model. Say, what we like about this and we think that is replicable is that they're not just saying all spyware, all bad, all the time. If you're using spyware in the way that the organizations that sell it talk about wanting it to be used, you're talking about going after terrorists, you're talking about going after drug dealers, you're talking about going after human kidnappers, human traffickers. And if that's the case, and other countries can say, okay, we can do an evaluation of this that doesn't just demonize us, then yeah, that's the upside. That's the potential upside.
And there is a double edge to that sword, as we know. But can you also delineate the difference between, and again, I'm not very well versed on these issues, but between adware and spyware? So, I mean, a lot of us are concerned. Our phone seems to be always, anytime I talk about the New York Mets, I'm suddenly getting tickets at discounted prices. So,
yeah, I think they're quite different. You're talking about, malware that's embedded in ads versus if you're seeing this,
and they have to advertise. They have to
they do have to click on the advertisement. And if you look at what with spyware, you're going to find it when they do find it, they find it in weird places. They find it in like your Google Calendar. They find it in places that you wouldn't think, that I'm using this thing a lot for this, and therefore I'm going to be spied on in this place. They're kind of finding these pockets of your phone where you wouldn't normally be thinking, I'm going to be spied on here.
Sure.
I think a certain amount of consumer awareness exists that, my mom is just turned 70 last weekend. Happy birthday, Mom.
Happy birthday. Yeah.
She's smart enough to know, even though we don't talk about cybersecurity that much, she and I. She's smart enough to know that if she gets a text message from somebody and it's got a link in it, she probably shouldn't click on it. And she's got that next level.
So she reads your work.
She says she does. She says I don't understand it all that well. I was like, no, that's what I'm trying to do though. I'm trying to reach you. But she's also smart enough to the next level of like, I got a message from my brother, and my brother. This looks like it's part of a different chain. It's someone imitating him. So I think there's a level of awareness out there at a sort of a basic understanding level. And that's not denigrating my mom at all, or intelligence, but she is not someone who focuses on this the way I do, or the way you do. That when you're out there on the internet, you're at risk. You might be doing something that causes you harm, and adware's in that category. Even though you're the one, you're the victim, the thing you do leads to you helping become victimized, unfortunately. With spyware, you just have to have a phone, basically.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what makes it so much more dangerous and insidious, potentially, when it's used incorrectly.
You wanted to bring us back to the U.S. Anything on the policy side there that you'd like to share? Yeah,
you mentioned the sanctions. You mentioned the executive order. I think from the standpoint of the U.S., the executive order is much more focused internally, if we're talking about comparing it to Poland. The executive order is saying this is how we're going to use or not use spyware.
Or not. Yep.
So that's a level. That's another way of comparing it. The sanctions, I think about this a lot. I'm guessing you do too. That people are constantly questioning whether sanctions are making a difference, and they're constantly trying to evaluate. If you look at what's happening in Ukraine, have the sanctions made a difference there? It's a constant evaluation of what's making a difference. The other, the second biggest, most attention-getting family of spyware is the Predator spyware. There's NSO Pegasus, which is where the company is named after. The Predator spyware has gone a little dark of late, and by that I mean researchers just aren't seeing it doing as much. And when I asked them what was happening, when I talked to a senior U.S. administration official about what was happening, there was a consensus that it looked like, most likely, the sanctions had made a difference here. If you follow the timeline of when Predator was claiming more victims and when these researchers were calling out the infrastructure and saying that's Predator, they're not able to do that as much, going back to last summer, but especially last fall, and then continuing especially into March of this year, which is when the administration's sanctions got more specific on the Intel family, which is the alliance or group is what people even call it, that is the producer of the Predator spyware.
And we recently had Tom Conklin on to talk about OFAC and some of the tools that can be applied there. I think we're right to be questioning, but I also think we need to be looking at all the tools that we have available.
Yeah,
to push
absolutely.
back,
And
right?
I think the spyware story is not a good or pleasant story overall.
Is it one you think you're going to be writing about for a long time?
I think so, yeah. Because even if even the researchers who are saying we're not seeing them as much anymore, we're allowing for the possibility. Even the U.S. administration I talked to was allowing for the possibility that they've just found a way to hide themselves more. And there's this cops and robbers game that we've had in cyber all the time.
Yeah.
This is the variation of it. And if you look at the way things have been going, we've been hearing, the arc of the spyware story has been we're hearing more and more and more. We're seeing more and more and more. We're uncovering more and more. These two stories that we're talking about are examples of where it actually might be going decently. And when you're a reporter, you're thinking. Sometimes they say that the dog
They're
that
the ones
doesn't
that are
bark,
getting caught. Exactly.
Yeah, what's new? The story is bad all the time. So what's new? Well, there's some of these glimmers of a difference being made, and that's newsworthy too.
And that is newsworthy. And talk about another big story that many in your field have been covering, but you in particular have been doing some really interesting work. The CSRB and CISA and some of the findings vis-a-vis Microsoft. So I know that that is a big story, a lot to unpack that we won't have time to get into great detail here. But paint the picture for us. And
Yeah.
were you surprised that a quasi-government entity came out with such a strong report?
I and everyone else I know was a little taken aback by how harsh the report was in describing Microsoft's flaws. And if you're just talking about the Cyber Safety Review Board, this is this new board that's a fascinating creation of the Cyber Solarium Commission that came up with one of the ideas that was pushing this. The report was pretty blazing hot.
Yeah, it was.
And if you've watched the House hearing where Brad Smith was called onto the carpet, one of the issues that came up, and I think this is something I just want to bring up because I was thinking about it. That board does have people on it that are Microsoft competitors, but they all recused themselves. And it came up at the hearing that that this might have been the product of companies going after their competitor. I don't think that's the case. And I've been fascinated by Microsoft in the cyberspace for so long. I wrote a story several years back that I'm sort of bragging here a little bit, but I think presaged to a certain degree the way that Microsoft has had an influence in this world. They have capabilities that are in terms of understanding the threat landscape, in terms of responding to the threats, in terms of producing products that can respond to the threat. They're in that sort of next level of just below the state. Some people were saying they've got nation-state level capabilities to me for that story that came out many years ago. But as much as they're part of the solution and have been a part of the solution, they've also been a massive part of the problem. Their threat what's the word I'm looking for? Not landscape, but their surface.
Attack surface.
Attack surface is so massive. They're everywhere. Microsoft is in everything. Even though I use an Apple computer at home, I'm using Microsoft products. It's just they're everywhere, and
they are ubiquitous.
They're ubiquitous.
Yeah.
And they are so big that they're going to get attacked no matter what, and they're going to be big targets no matter what. But what has been notable is that the tenor of the response from government and people who are not competitors is they need to do a lot better than they've been doing. A lot better.
And in your stories, what surprised you, since you have been covering this issue for a long time, and they really are ubiquitous within the U.S. government, American society, and more broadly. So understandably, they're going to have a big target on their backs.
Yeah, and one of the stories, credit to my colleagues, I think Rebecca Highwile and AJ Vicens were on a story that I did about this attack, the Midnight Blizzard attack, and about it affecting the government in ways that had not been previously known. That what I think has been the biggest change since I have been following Microsoft is that before there just weren't very many people, and there certainly wasn't a crescendo of it the way there is now, of people suggesting that maybe the federal government doesn't need to be relying on Microsoft to the degree that it does. Perhaps they need to be thinking about different ways of approaching this problem and breaking up to what degree they use Microsoft products for one thing and use it for another. The stack, if you will. That is something that I had not heard the kind of calls for that we're hearing now. Maybe there have been glimmers of it, but not the level of it. That's a big shift in what's going on with Microsoft.
And compare and contrast Midnight Blizzard with SolarWinds.
Interesting question. I think SolarWinds may have been a little craftier, that they might have been able to hide themselves a lot longer. They might have been much more targeted. Feels like Midnight Blizzard was much more broad and kind of going after everybody. Then one of the groups happened to be the federal government. I think those are the big differences. And then there's always the China versus Russia approach and the whole idea about who's noisier versus who's not. I do think it's interesting that.
And sometimes it's just who gets caught when.
Right? Yeah.
So,
I do think we've seen it. This. I think it's Rob Joyce who used the metaphor. I can't remember who used it first, but he uses it a lot about the if cyber is climate change, China's climate change, and Russia is a hurricane. I might have the terminology just a little bit there. That one is very obviously destructive and isn't it doesn't have that kind of creeping effect that climate change has had on our world. That's changed a little bit too. It used to be that China were the people who were really good at hiding and waiting and picking out the things for espionage and using it selectively. Russia was very messy. I think that's changed. It feels like China's been willing to be a bit more scattershot, and this might be an example of that.
Yeah, and Volt Typhoon, I think, is also indicative of intentions that could be different than purely computer network exploit or espionage to much more mapping, going beyond mapping and pre-positioning assets.
Yeah, Volt Typhoon is definitely one of the big scary ones that if you're worried about cyber attacks in our world, you should be worried about them way up there.
We haven't discussed this, and obviously the findings are still very early, not even the first inning. But what do you think of overturning of Chevron doctrine? Do you think that will have any implications to at least the way this administration has been addressing cybersecurity?
Yeah, I do think it will. I don't think, everybody I've talked to is saying, yes, it's going to, but the how? That's what's interesting.
Still early.
I was watching a congressional hearing with the EPA administrator the other day, and he was getting back and forth with Republicans about, does this mean you're going to have to overturn? And he's like, that's not what the ruling says. It's a
Neither of us are lawyers. So,
well, it's a forthcoming interview with somebody who, you'll see it when the story publishes, but I asked them about Chevron, and they were like, this is really all to be determined. This person was very involved in the administration's approach to regulation, which has been one of the most remarkable things about this administration, I think. And they were saying, we're going to have to wait and see. I wonder, if I'm speculating a little bit, which is what I'm doing, I'm wondering how much people will be being a little more cautious about moving forward with new stuff. I think that's where the impact comes. I think,
so not so much rolling back existing, it's more...
Not right yet, but I do think, this is what, you and I were like right here on this thought. We were just about to arrive at the same exact point, which is that I have been asking people, the SEC's rules on cybersecurity disclosure have been the most controversial, other than perhaps the EPA's rules, which were actually rolled back. They have been the most controversial. If you're talking about people being upset about them, there's bipartisan on the Hill, disappointment or frustration or even rage sometimes about those rules. The industry certainly hasn't liked them, and I keep asking everyone, why hasn't anybody challenged it yet? And Chevron seems like an opening, but people are still playing wait and see. I think I think they want to see. The rules have only been out for a little while. I had a story that just came out very recently about how these rules the SEC rules are being interpreted. That some people, we had the CDK hack, which all the automobile dealers who used the CDK software went to the SEC and disclosed it. The company that owns CDK said this is not going to have any material impact on our work.
Which is fascinating.
And it's just a gigantic company, and there's all these how would someone determine what kind of impact something has, such that they need to report it to the SEC, and it varies depending on the company. It varies depending on how you define materiality, and how you, after you make the idea of this is the definition of it, how do we then interpret it and say, well, what about reputational harm to our company? What about how much money we pay to ransomware dealer groups? There's all these areas that are extremely unsettled that makes if you go back to my very
feeling
early,
that it's subjective, right?
Yeah.
That precedents still haven't been fully set.
Right. We have not moved from subjective to objective, and it'll take some court rulings on this before I think we get to that. If we go back to the early days of why I cared about covering about cybersecurity and why I cared about covering it, I always thought...
And you really have been at it from the beginning, the get-go, as we were calling it cyber.
Yeah, I took a little bit of a break here and there to cover Veterans Affairs or foreign policy, but I always kept coming back to cyber. And what I found so compelling about it was that it was this Wild West of us not knowing what to do with any of this.
Exactly.
And trying to find that area, trying to find that, okay, this is the way we really should approaching this, the way we approach, say, nuclear weaponry. Not to say that the scale of the damage is the same or anything like that, but it's just this new thing that is influencing so much and so much is happening in the world. How do we deal with it? And I've been covering how policymakers have been trying to do this all the way since back then. And what's the most Wild West right now, I think, other than, we talked about spyware, I think that's one of them, is this regulatory approach of this administration and how they've been going about it, and how is it going to play out? How is it going to, some of these rules are very new, and some of them haven't been implemented yet.
And Tim, in a way, you can't cover cyber and you can't divorce cyber from geopolitics, from foreign policy, from economic policy, and pretty much everything else. It's almost like oxygen.
I was talking to I found this person who told me this. This is back, I think it was about 2007, 2008, but no later than 2009 when Capitol Hill was first saying, we are going to pass comprehensive cybersecurity legislation. And I finally remembered what aide it was that I was talking to about this. That aide said, and I asked him, how are you going to pass comprehensive cybersecurity legislation? What's going to be in it? And he said, well, that's kind of the problem. It's like trying to pass a comprehensive air bill. It touches everything.
Everything.
And that was one of the first big moments where I said, oh, I think I need to be covering cybersecurity all the time instead of just as part of some of the other things I'm doing.
Well, I'm really happy you chose that path. So,
Thank you.
Which is great. So you also have written recently around BGP and some of the FCC, so to stick with sort of that regulatory sets of issues, anything, and for transparency, this was a priority recommendation of the Solarium Commission, one that we didn't get fully over the goal line, but it looks like we got some traction. So
yeah, it's been remarkable that there was, again, talking to someone in the administration who was laying out this is the way we want to go with this.
And can you help our viewers and listeners understand the significance of BGP? So
yeah, I mean anything you do on the internet, BGP is involved.
All traffic's routed.
All internet. It's a set of technical standards for how the internet is routed. So if you're on a website, your BGP is in your world. So we've seen that initial batch of rules about TSA and oil pipelines, which is obviously related to the Colonial Pipeline attack from 2021. We're now seeing some of these areas that are not considered as big in terms of critical infrastructure, but are really, really important, that are starting to get some attention. And the BGP is one that the FCC and CISA have been talking about for a while as the most important part of the internet you haven't heard of. It's fundamental to everything. If you get hijacked, they can just steal everything they want. These were the kind of threats that they were talking about and worried about. And the FCC has been signaling since the net neutrality rules were first getting talked about, being revised, and they finally have in the last recent months actually started to put in place a rule about this. Now we're still in the notice of proposed rulemaking
actually
phase.
Also named and shamed China in particular here for hijacking traffic.
Exactly. Yeah, they use that
Which
as
is a big
specific
deal.
example.
I mean, 5 years ago that would never have been public discussion,
Yeah,
even if they knew about it.
It was. I don't know if you remember, but I certainly remember when when the Obama administration named North Korea for the Sony attack. It was such a big deal.
That was a big deal. Yeah,
and everybody was like, "Are you sure about that? How do you know?
Are you sure you want to talk about that?"
And that's always the attribution problem has always been a big problem. So it feels like it's more endemic now to everything that comes out.
And
they're saying we're doing this because these people are causing us this harm.
And I think cyber threat intelligence companies have been helpful in terms of shedding light on the perpetrator, so we can actually start naming. I think that is part of it, so the government couldn't be stuck way behind in that discussion.
Exactly. No, I completely agree with you.
But back to BGP. I'm sorry for.
No, it's okay. So the FCC has a rule that they are asking people to talk about. It involves, if you're a internet service provider, you have to say these are my rules for safe routing. And if you're one of the biggest of the biggest, you have to get quarterly updates about how it's going. There were some groups that were, industry groups were worried about this. One of the common threads of anything that, anytime there's a regulation, the industry groups are not going to like it. They're going to say we don't like it because, for the most part, they occasionally will come to a certain level of peace with it. But they're going to say, we prefer you don't do this. But there were some groups that were, while industry affiliated to a certain degree because they were sponsored by some of those groups. They're think tank type groups, or more groups that are more like activist groups in the internet world, like the Internet Society, the Global Cyber Alliance, who were saying, wait a minute, this is a little scary. This is not great. If you come up with these rules, and another country comes up with these rules, that's going to be bad news. The thing was that some of them were put at ease by what they finally came out with, which was much less, this is exactly how we want you to, these are the things we want you to do to make your internet routing secure. They're saying, we want to report from you on it, we want to hear from you on it, you need to make it public, that kind of thing.
Which may serve as a roadmap back to the broader discussion around regulate, not regulate, because it does seem to be the go-to solution that maybe hasn't had the impact we want. But the flip side is market forces don't take us that last mile, and that last mile is important. So I think we're still struggling with defining and building the business case around cybersecurity.
Big time. I couldn't agree with you more. There's been this long little thread I've been following of, you go back to Bruce Schneier, like many years ago, in the early aughts, saying nobody's going to do anything about this until you regulate them. And he was mainly talking about the software makers.
Yep. We still haven't figured that out. But
well,
that's
right. But now there's at least this little bit of a push. Like, it's not quite regulation, but there's this push to do the secure by design stuff that the system's been talking about, the administration's been talking about.
And cyber-informed engineering, I got to get that in there. Okay.
You got to.
Yep.
Yeah, we have that memory safe language and stuff like that, right?
Yep.
Definitely. Those things are finally starting to go from this not going to happen. We need to keep our hands off of it at all times. If you start regulating in this space, you're going to stifle innovation. You're going to make people have checkboxes. There's still those concerns about the regulation.
And there are still some legitimate concerns around that.
There absolutely are. But we're at least now moving to a discussion. We're at least now moving to a moment where the United States, is doing something. They're exploring it. They're seeing what they can do. And there are still people, I even had conversations with as recently as yesterday, saying these rules aren't going far enough. They're not doing enough. Nothing's changing.
Tim, the tyranny of time, because I know you've got a hard stop for your day job, but what questions didn't
This is part of my day job, Frank.
Exactly. What questions didn't I ask that I should have? And not to scoop Cyberscoop, but what's front of mind sort of looking forward for you right now?
Yeah. How do I do that without scooping myself?
Mini scoop.
I mean, I think we were talking about this internally. My company doesn't just have a journalistic outlet; it has an events business, and they're talking about doing. We're talking about doing events all the time, and maybe we bounce off of each other, like who should we pick? And one of the things I said was, well, we just don't. It's kind of tough to say who you should be having on stage, given that we have an election in November, and I think. One of the storylines I'm looking at, we're not just me, but other people in my organization are looking at, is, what would a change mean? What have we got? What has been done?
And you saw some RNC platform language around cyber that sounded a little consistent with where we are, actually.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it used to be a thing where if you saw that in there at all, that was a big headline.
Yeah, exactly.
In the cyber world. Now it's kind of like, oh, yeah.
Good. It's breathing.
It's
oxygen.
It should be there. It should be there. So that's an area of upcoming exploration for us, certainly, and I wouldn't be surprised if I'm not alone in that. But I think if I wasn't doing the kind of reporting I want to be doing right now, I wouldn't be exploring all of this stuff. The things that we've talked about today are the things I wanted to get into because they are the things that are next, or the things that are
good for you,
on the perimeter or on the edge of what is still being sorted out. So in a way, I've defined my job description such that I don't have a good answer for your question.
That's actually a great answer, and more importantly, a great outcome. Tim, thank you for continuing to break news, but also provide essential context around issues that, whether we know it or not, affect all of us and will affect all of us going forward. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for doing what you do.
Point of pride for me on the context thing. Thank you. I know I don't want to be scaring people just to scare people. I want to say this let's have a fair estimation of what this threat is, what the issues are, what the landscape is. And thanks to you for doing this program and having me on it.
Thank you, Tim.